Welcome to the debate. There is a phrase that has become the ultimate verbal shrug of the 21st century. It is what it is. Usually when you hear that, it's an admission of defeat. It's what you say when the car breaks down or the deal falls through, or you just feel helpless. But today we are digging into a text that takes that throwaway line and turns it into a weapon. We're looking at the manifesto, It Is What It Is by Coach De Bruyns. And this isn't your standard self-help fluff about manifesting your destiny. This is a dense, aggressive treatise on survival, the mechanics of power, and the biological imperatives that, according to the author, drive every single thing we do.
It is certainly intense. I think aggressive is the right word. It reads less like a philosophy book and more like a collision between evolutionary biology, Stoic philosophy, and, a street fighting manual. It's fascinating. But it paints a picture of the world that is stark, to say the least.
Stark. Or just honest. That's really the question we're going to be wrestling with. The central question for this episode is simple. Is the philosophy of It Is What It Is a rigorous, necessary acceptance of nature's harsh laws, a manual for mental toughness? Or is it, as I suspect you might argue, a cynical surrender to the darker parts of human nature?
I'm definitely leaning toward the latter. Look, I appreciate the realism. I think we can all agree that the world isn't all sunshine and rainbows. But this text seems to confuse, description with prescription. It looks at how brutal nature can be. Wolves eating sheep, the strong dominating the weak, and it just assumes that human society must replicate that brutality to function.
And I am here to take the advocate position. My argument is that De Bruyns provides a necessary antidote to modern delusion. We live in a world that constantly tells us reality is malleable, that we can identify as whatever we want, that safety is a guaranteed right. This text argues that reality is a physical, biological wall. You don't negotiate with a wall. You either align yourself with the laws of nature, pain, competition, hierarchy, or you break yourself against them.
Well, I'm ready to break some walls then. Or at least break down the arguments. Where do we start?
Let's start with the foundation. The text opens with a concept that I think is hard to argue with, even for you. Existence is massively interconnected. And De Bruyns isn't talking about some, spiritual, we are all one vibe here. He's talking about a causal web. He uses the example of the 2020 pandemic.
Right, the butterfly effect.
Exactly. A microscopic virus jumps species in one wet market, and weeks later, stock markets crash in New York, supply chains freeze in Europe, and people are locked in their homes in Australia. It's a terrifying proof of concept.
I don't dispute the interconnectedness. We are clearly part of a complex system. If chaos theory has taught us anything, it's that small inputs can have massive outputs.
But it's the implication of that web that matters. De Bruyns argues your goal is to survive as a collective. Because we are so linked, individual comfort is secondary to the survival of the species. He uses this incredible analogy of bone density. He points out that bones only get stronger through microfracturing. You have to lift heavy loads, you have to put the bone under stress, creating tiny little breaks so it calcifies and comes back stronger.
It's a classic anti-fragile argument.
It is. But he takes it a step further. He argues that modern society has removed the load. We are obsessed with comfort. But the text says, bluntly, comfort is not your friend. If you remove the stress, the structure collapses.
Okay, I appreciate the physiological metaphor. We know that astronauts lose bone density in space because there's no gravity, no stress. But leaping from bones need gravity to society needs suffering is where I get off the train. The text seems to suggest that if you give people comfort, they will, and I quote, die of obesity and heart disease within 2 generations. It presents this false dichotomy. You are either suffering and strong, or you are comfortable and die.
Is it a false dichotomy, though? Look at the health data of the developed world. We have engineered physical struggle out of our lives. We have air conditioning, DoorDash, elevators, and what's the result? Metabolic dysfunction, soaring depression rates, a lack of resilience. The text extends this to the psyche. The argument is that there is no neutral ground. You're either contributing to the strength of the collective web, pulling the weight, creating those microfractures that lead to growth, or you are draining it. You're a parasite.
But that no neutral ground stance creates a hyper-competitive, almost paranoid worldview. It implies that every interaction, every moment is a test of utility. The text says we are fundamentally competing with everyone. It frames life as a zero-sum game.
Can you clarify that term for our listeners who might not be economists?
Sure. A zero-sum game means that for me to win, you have to lose. The pie is fixed. If I take a slice, that's one less slice for you. But human history shows that cooperation actually enlarges the pie. We can create value together. This text, however, seems to think we are just fighting over the same scraps. And this is where I find a massive contradiction in De Bruyns' work.
Go on.
On one hand, he preaches collective survival. We must save the species. But on the other hand, he gives advice on how to manipulate that collective for your own gain. He suggests strategies like always play dumb, be ruthless, and apologize selectively. You cannot claim your highest goal is the web of humanity while simultaneously handing out a dagger to cut your way to the center of it.
I think you're reading malice into what is essentially strategy. The text explicitly defines greatness not as being harmless, but as, and this is a key quote, being capable of doing immense evil but choosing to instead do good.
The Jordan Peterson argument.
It's a valid point. A rabbit isn't virtuous because it doesn't eat the wolf. It's just harmless. A wolf that chooses not to eat the rabbit, that's control. That's virtue. The text is telling you to be dangerous so that you can be useful, and being useful often requires navigating power dynamics, which brings us to the most contentious point in the material, the necessity of hierarchy.
Yes, we have to talk about this. The text is obsessed with rank.
It is obsessed with reality. The text states clearly, hierarchies are natural. Whether it's a wolf pack, a corporation, or a family, someone has to be in charge. De Bruyns argues that egalitarianism, the idea that everyone is equal in authority, inevitably dissolves into chaos. He even points out that inequality is actually necessary for an ecosystem to function.
How so? Because usually inequality is seen as a bug, not a feature.
Well, he frames it symbiotically. The rich need the poor to provide labor and execution. The poor need the rich to provide innovation, capital, and risk management. It's an ecosystem. If you remove the predators, the deer overpopulate and starve. If you remove the leaders, the group lacks direction.
Okay, but that is a textbook example of the naturalistic fallacy.
Define that for us.
The naturalistic fallacy is the error of assuming that just because something is a certain way in nature, it ought to be that way morally. Yes, wolves kill the weak. Yes, chimps have violent dominance hierarchies, but we invented laws, ethics, and civilization specifically to transcend those animalistic drives. We don't say, well, murder happens in nature, so we should allow it.
Fair point, but the text isn't arguing for murder. It's arguing against the illusion of freedom. De Bruyns writes that individual freedom was an illusion. He suggests that when parameters and boundaries are removed, people don't naturally drift toward harmony. They drift toward excess, confusion, and eventually, they crave a strong hand to restore order.
Which sounds suspiciously like an apology for authoritarianism. You can't handle freedom, so here's a dictator.
Not a dictator, but a structure. He argues power, when stable, is better than a power vacuum. Look at foreign policy over the last 20 years. We've seen regime changes where we toppled a bad guy without a plan, and the result wasn't democracy, it was warlords and total collapse. The text is making a pragmatic point. Imperfect order is better than perfect chaos. Humans have a psychological need to know where they stand in the pecking order.
But the order he describes is defined entirely by dominance. There is a fight for dominance, he writes. It reduces all human striving to a might makes right scenario. It dismisses the possibility that we could organize society based on empathy or justice or mutual aid, rather than just who has the biggest guns or the most money.
Text would argue that you can only have empathy after you have security. And security comes from dominance. But let's pivot to where this hierarchy hits the personal level most heavily. We need to talk about the section on gender and the mating market.
I knew we were heading here. This is the part of the text that is going to make a lot of modern listeners recoil.
It's a cold shower for sure, but let's look at the argument dispassionately. De Bruyns is applying evolutionary psychology. He argues that men are objective and oriented towards things, while women are subjective and oriented towards people. He claims this isn't sexism, just biological specialization.
It's biological essentialism, and it's pretty reductive.
But look at the statistics he cites. He breaks down the sexual marketplace with the 20-30-50 split. He argues that the top 20% of men, high status, high resources, attract 100% of the women. The middle 30% are basically invisible, and the bottom 50% get, and I'm using his word here, the scraps.
Scraps. That language alone reveals the rottenness philosophy. It frames human intimacy as a brutal, cold economic transaction. It treats women as commodities to be hoarded by the top 20%, and it tells men that their entire worth as human beings is dependent on their ability to conquer and spread their genes.
He talks about opportunity costs in dating. It's clinical.
It's dehumanizing. It completely ignores companionship, intellectual connection, humor, or love that exists outside of status seeking. It assumes every woman is just looking for a wallet and every man is just looking for a womb.
He doesn't ignore those things. He argues they are secondary to the biological imperative. He notes that men look for fertility and submission because it guarantees paternity. That's just evolutionary biology 101. Women look for strength and dominance because, historically, that meant survival for their offspring. And he makes a provocative point about modern relationships failing. He says when a man loses attraction to his wife, it's often because she exhibits male characteristics. She becomes the boss, the aggressor. When a woman loses attraction to her husband, it's because he's too submissive. He's diagnosing that we are unhappy because we are fighting our hardwiring.
Or he is enforcing rigid stereotypes that doom us to unhappiness. By telling a man that if his wife is assertive, he should be turned off because she's acting male, the text creates the very conflict it claims to explain. And think about what this tells the bottom 50% of men. If you aren't in that top tier, the text says you are selected for extinction. That is a recipe for radicalization, despair, and hatred, not self-improvement.
I strongly disagree there. I think it's the ultimate empowerment.
How is being told you're selected for extinction empowering?
Because it strips away the lie that you're perfect just the way you are. The text says, if you are losing at life, change your habits. It champions the idea that the tortoise always wins. Consistency beats talent. It gives the loser a roadmap. It says, stop complaining that the game is unfair. The game is unfair. So get in the gym, get your finances in order, learn to be dangerous. It provides a path to cross that line from the 50% to the 20%.
I see the appeal of the bootstraps narrative, but let's look at the ethics required to climb that ladder. This brings me back to the be ruthless section. The text advises that if someone disrespects you, you should shut that person down immediately. It mentions looking at people with a cold, dead stare. It encourages a level of interpersonal hostility that seems paranoid.
You're cherry-picking the aggression. He prefaces that by saying it is important to respect everyone. The ruthlessness is a response to hostility, not the default setting. He writes, leverage is your only guarantor. In a world where corruption cannot be eradicated, another key point he makes, you have to be able to defend yourself.
But consider the anecdote about the workplace he shares. The author describes a job where the management was disorganized and chaotic. His response wasn't to help fix it or to leave. His advice? Always play dumb. He pretended to be incompetent so they would demand less of him. He calls this survival, but I call it parasitism. He's shifting the burden to his colleagues who are working hard. How does that square with his earlier demand to contribute to the collective?
That's a fair critique, but I'd frame it as asymmetric warfare. He realized the system was broken. The management was incompetent. He wasn't hurting the collective. He was refusing to participate in inefficiency. That's the tortoise. Conserving energy. And remember, the text also says, always keep your promises and never lie to undercut others.
But he just advised lying about his competence.
There is a distinction between malicious lying to harm someone and strategic camouflage to protect yourself from exploitation. It's a pragmatist's honor. It's about survival in a corrupt environment.
It feels like a fractured code to me.
It creates a personality that is deeply suspicious, constantly calculating leverage, constantly hiding its true capabilities. The text says, "The world is not a friendly place. The less people know about you, the better." That leads to a life of isolation. You're in a bunker of your own making.
It leads to a life of safety. The text is preparing the reader for a world that is constantly shifting. You can't rely on the goodwill of others. This leads to the section on change is constant. I love the image of the dogs in the desert. Did that resonate with you?
You mean the dogs drinking from plastic bottles?
Exactly. He describes these wild dogs in a desert who have learned to bite open discarded plastic water bottles to drink. The ecosystem changed, humans brought plastic, and the animals adapted. He argues we are no longer in nature, we are cyborgs attached to our phones. The text argues we must adapt or die. If you resist technology or change because it's unnatural, you will be the dog that dies of thirst next to a sealed bottle.
I agree that adaptation is necessary. We can't be Luddites. But the text pairs this adaptation with a strange, almost religious determinism. And this is where the philosophy gets really trippy. He says life is a theater and only God has the script.
Yes, the pivot to theology.
He argues that things are always perfect. Even war, rape, and greed are perfect because they create the necessary balance of the universe. He says it is perfect that the good are molded through the existence of evil.
That is the ultimate Stoic position. Amor fati, love your fate. It's the idea that you cannot have light without shadow.
But it borders on fatalism. If war and atrocity are perfect because they are part of the script, does that not absolve us of the responsibility to stop them? If the script is written, why try to improve society? Why fight for justice if injustice is just a necessary counterweight? It seems to encourage passivity in the face of evil. Oh, well, it is what it is.
No, you're missing the nuance. He says, the only thing you have in front of you is a sign-up sheet where you get to choose which character you will play. We cannot stop war entirely. History proves that war is a constant. We can't eliminate greed, but we can choose to be the warrior who protects or the villain who destroys. We can't rewrite reality. The stage is set, the props are there, but we must pick a side. It's a call to agency within a predetermined framework.
I find that distinction incredibly thin. Telling a victim of the strong that their suffering is part of a perfect balance is intellectually cruel. It serves the winners of the hierarchy very well to tell the losers that their position is just part of the script.
And telling them that the world should be fair when it clearly isn't is intellectual malpractice. That's the core of this book. It isn't about what we want, it's about what is. You can cry about the script, you can scream at the director, or you can learn your lines and perform.
And that brings us to the conclusion.
Indeed. Look, I'm not saying this manifesto is a comforting bedtime story. It's not. It's a bucket of ice water. It's a manual for mental toughness. By accepting that life is a competition, that resources are limited, hungry people will fight, as he says, and that the collective survival matters more than your individual feelings, you can navigate reality. You stop wishing for a fantasy and start dealing with the world as it exists.
And I will conclude by saying that while the text offers warnings against complacency, and I agree that strong men create easy times is a valid historical observation, its worldview is ultimately bleak. It encourages us to see our neighbors as potential threats, our spouses as biological chess pieces, and our lives as a zero-sum game. It might help you survive, but I question if a life lived with that much suspicion is a life worth living.
By history, perhaps by God.
The question is, do we just read the lines we're handed, or is there room to improvise?
That is for our listeners to decide. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
Thank you.